I hope you've had some opportunities by now to do some breath awareness meditation and to do some formal and informal walking and eating practice. And you're beginning to see how these practices can bring insight into how the mind creates suffering for itself. I wonder during your meditation, did you discover a little homunculus inside? Did you find a self? Or did you find an ever-changing kaleidoscope of different sensations, thoughts, and images? This question hasn't been discussed extensively yet among clinicians as mindfulness practices are being adapted into Western psychotherapeutic interventions, but it's becoming a hot topic with advances in neurobiology that are bringing the question into the forefront of biological research. In their original context of Buddhist psychology, these practices were designed to help us see more clearly the nature of the self, or to be more precise, how we construct a sense of self moment to moment. Buddhist tradition and Western cognitive science suggest that try as we might, all we find if we examine our experience carefully are sensations and images, accompanied by a remarkably persistent narrative about our desires, about our fears, about who we think we are. The I or the me can't actually be found. It's said that if we practice intensively enough, we'll see that we're actually not who we usually think we are. Instead, we'll see ourselves as a modern physicist, biologist, or cognitive scientist might describe us. Let's do a little thought experiment to illustrate how this works. Consider the experience of a little girl eating an apple. And let's say she bites into that apple and looks at the remaining apple and sees half a worm. She's a smart little girl, she realizes what's going on, and she's about to spit out the chewed material in her mouth. Now, I ask you to consider, what is that chewed material? Would you say that the chewed material is still essentially the apple, or has it already become the little girl? If I asked you to vote on that, what would you select? Now let's assume that there's no half of a worm and she continues eating the apple, but if she were having a bad day, it could still come up. So that stuff that's now in her stomach, how would you vote about that? Would you say that that's still essentially the apple? Would you say, nah, now it's the little girl? How would you vote? Or imagine taking it a little further. Imagine she's having a good day, she continues to digest it, and that material gets into her intestines, and in the process, the fructose of the apple is broken down into glucose, it gets absorbed into her bloodstream, and it's now her blood sugar. What's that? They're certainly atoms of the apple. Would you say they're still the apple? Or would you say, no, now they're the little girl? And we might take this even further. Imagine that the glucose molecules of the blood are being picked up by the cells, and through the magic of the Krebs cycle and ATP and all the things you might have learned about in high school biology, her cells are using the energy in that glucose in order to recombine amino acids and create new cellular structures. Those new cellular structures, since they're fueled by the apple, are they still the apple? Or have they now become the little girl? Most people at this point vote, I think they're the little girl. But there's, of course, part of the apple that we don't digest. We call this fiber or cellulose. And let's imagine that that's continued down the alimentary canal. And it's now being aggregated, preparing to go into a familiar white porcelain receptacle. Now that stuff, how would you vote? And here I'll give you 3 options to make it easier. That stuff, we could say, it's still the apple. After all, it's cellulose from the apple. It's the little girl. It's been in there for a little while. Or I'll give you a 3rd option. It's something else. Most people vote for it's something else. It's interesting, we don't like to identify with our feces as either us or to think of our feces as what we eat. We like to think that's something else. So have you noticed the problem here? There isn't a sharp line of demarcation between where the apple ends and where the girl begins. In fact, we might say that it's an apple-girl system that's unfolding in each moment. And there are countless other examples of this. Consider looking at a picture, if you would, of just the tops of the fingers of a hand. Can you imagine that? Now, if you just looked at the top of fingers, you'd say, well, these 4 entities or objects, they clearly have a familial connection. They're similar to one another, but they certainly also look quite separate. That is indeed how we usually see objects in the world. What's revealed in mindfulness practice is the whole hand. We actually notice that the separate individual things of the world are part of larger organisms. We see the interconnections. Consider an ant colony for a moment. All of the different elements in the ant colony have separate roles. There's the queen, the worker, the drone. Biologists, starting actually in the late 1700s, defined organisms like ant colonies as superorganisms. They're any organism in which the different so-called individuals have differentiated roles and the whole system collapses if they're not all present. One could consider human beings as a sort of superorganism. Do you happen to be a subsistence farmer? I'm not either. That means we're quite dependent on one another to provide energy, to provide food, to provide shelter, and all of the things we need for our survival. Yet, most of the time, at least I don't recognize this. If I'm running late to see a patient, and I'm running into a convenience store because I have several hours back to back this afternoon, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be hungry, and I just want to quickly buy a sandwich before my first appointment. And there's a fellow in front of me who's decided that this is his red letter day, and he has carefully chosen 23 scientifically selected lottery numbers that he's playing. And I'm waiting and waiting, worried I'm going to be late. I don't see him as part of me. I don't see us as part of the same superorganism. Rather, I see him as a problem. And in fact, when there are laser beams coming out of my eyes, burning holes in the back of his skull, screaming, "Why don't you just set the money on fire? It'll be so much quicker and have the same result." He doesn't sense this, but I don't feel connected with him. What I notice when I do mindfulness practice is, and this is a little horrifying to see, is that basically I see other things in the world in terms of how they might fulfill or thwart my desires. So other people, for example, are friends, others who might support me, or perhaps enemies in some way, they might threaten me, or perhaps servants, they might do something or give me something, or when I'm not being vegetarian, which for me is much of the time, I might see other beings as meat, something that I might actually eat. So how do we develop this separate sense of self which divides the world into objects and doesn't notice the fluid interconnections of things, doesn't notice that you and I are part of the superorganism? Well, Buddhist psychology outlined the process some 2,500 years ago. And this formulation aligns remarkably well with how a cognitive scientist would describe it today. In the Buddhist psychological formulation, our sense of ourselves starts with the coming together of a sense organ with a sense object, and then we have awareness of that object. So this involves 6 senses. Seeing involves the eyes coming into contact with the visual field, hearing, the ears coming into contact with the audio field, and going on with smelling, tasting, and touching. The 6th sense is interesting. The 6th sense isn't some woo-woo kind of 6th sense. It's everything else. So if I asked you right now, if you're not driving, to close your eyes for a second and conjure up an image of your mother, whether she's alive or no longer, you can probably do that. That would be an example of this 6th sense. It's not direct sensory contact, it's an experience happening in the mind. Or if I were to ask you to count silently to 3, do this right now, that would be an example of the 6th sense. Collectively, they're typically called thinking. So what we start to see here is we are psychophysiological organisms that don't exactly exist, but we occur moment by moment, and the first occurrence of this involves sense contact. Now, we don't stay at the level of sense contact for very long. We organize sensory experience into perceptions. I'm going to create some sounds, and I want you to just listen and see if you can hear these sounds as just sense sensations. Ready? Here they come. Elephant. Elephant. Are you able to just experience those as sensations, or did an image of a certain animal with a trunk come to mind? It's probably the latter. Or, for example, consider looking at an English written word, typed out, let's say. Let's say you see the following letters: P-E-R-C-E-P-T-I-O-N. Can you visualize those? Are you able to see simply the shapes of letters, basically fluid forms against a contrasting background? Or do sounds arise in the mind? For me, when I do this, I cannot not read it. The best I can do is break it up into per and sep and shun, but I can't not read it. Now, were they written in something other than English, I'd have no trouble not reading them. I remember when I was traveling around Thailand with my wife a number of years ago, and she was navigating in the back of the motorbike and I was driving, and we would get to an intersection, and the sign would say long squiggle, medium squiggle to the left, short squiggle, long squiggle, short squiggle to the right. And luckily, the Lonely Planet had things written out in Thai, and I could say, "Sweetheart, which way do we go?" And she could usually figure it out. So if things are written in Thai, I'm fine with staying at the sensory level and not organizing them into perception. But when things are written in English, I don't have that option. Now, finally, when you see the image that most of us have seen in introductory psych classes that looks like two things simultaneously. You could see two faces facing one another, and the faces themselves define a goblet. And as we look at it, we can see it as one or the other. And if you can picture that, are you actually able to see both the faces and the goblet simultaneously? Or do they actually appear in rapid oscillation? Most of us find that they appear in rapid oscillation, that it constellates itself as a goblet, then as two faces, and in fact the mind kind of struggles to make it into one or another. Now this makes perfect sense evolutionarily, because deciding beige rock, nah, lion, nah, probably beige, nah, maybe lion, it mattered a lot to us. You know, there's this well-known video of students playing basketball, and they're wearing black shirts and white shirts. And the task that people are assigned is to watch how many times the kids in the white shirts pass the basketball. And what happens is, in the middle of the video, a big black gorilla comes in, beats his chest, and exits the stage. And when people are asked to count the number of times the kids when the white shirts pass the basketball, about 2/3 of the audience simply doesn't see the gorilla. It's really quite remarkable. This is called inattentional blindness. And we see that perception, what we see, is terribly conditioned by culture, by language, and by desire. What happens in the video is we're trying to get the number right so we don't see the gorilla at all. And what happens is perception constructs and categorizes, and it omits details, and it fills in all sorts of missing information. Now, have you ever been in a situation, let's say with a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, some loved one, maybe a parent or a child, where you both were ostensibly in the same place, but you wound up perceiving it very differently? Have those differences in perception ever caused trouble? For most of us, they have. So a particularly wonderful recent study was done in which they took X-rays of the lungs, and they asked 24 radiologists to perform a familiar lung nodule detection task. And they were playing with the theme from the video I just described, and they placed a gorilla 48 times larger than the average lung nodule in the last case, the last slide. And 83% of the radiologists didn't see it. And they did eye tracking, and it revealed that the majority of them who missed the gorilla looked directly at it. So our perception is radically influenced by what's going on with our desires. And we fill in things too. Consider a large round circle with two small circles placed about 2/3 of the way up the middle of it. Can you visualize that? What might it be? Virtually everybody sees either a face, or a few people who probably are into this tend to see bowling balls more. We fill in details like this all the time, even though the nose and even the thumb hole from the bowling ball is quite missing. I'm sorry to say it gets worse, because we don't stay at the level of perception for very long. We add an affective or emotional or hedonic tone to all the experience. Everything that happens, we see it, feel it to be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. We love some things and we hate others. And then we develop what are called intentions and dispositions. I talked about this earlier. We try to hold on to pleasant experience, push away unpleasant experience, and we tend to ignore the neutral. When we do this over time, we develop habits of intention. And we have different words for these. We can call them dispositions. Behavioral folks call them learned behaviors or conditioned responses. And many of us actually refer to these dispositions, these habits of holding on to some things and pushing away others, as our personality. Now, how does that work? We see this most clearly in adolescence. When you're talking to a teenager and you're asking them about themselves, they'll say, well, I'm this kind of person. I'm into this kind of music. I'm not into that kind of music. I like reading, or I hate school, or I'm big on this kind of sport. I remember when I went college shopping with my twin daughters. Where I live in the Boston area, there's a lot of emphasis on education, and there are a lot of institutions of higher education nearby. So we were doing one of these tours of going to various liberal arts campuses in New England, and each one was more lovely than the last. They would have ivy-covered walls. They would have wonderful athletic facilities rivaling the things you find in Olympic stadiums these days. They would have diverse cafeterias that had the meat and potatoes crowd. They had something for vegans. They had something for the sushi and Asian fusion group. These are practically designed as adolescent theme parks with everything a kid might want. So we finished touring one of these colleges, and it was wonderful. Great curricular offerings on top of all of that. And I asked my daughter what she thought, and she said, well, it's a great school, but I don't think I'm going to apply. And I said, why not? And she said, well, did you see what the kids were wearing? And I said, clothes? Jeans and flip-flops like you, your sister, and all your friends wear? And then I got the eye roll. Oh, Dad, you are so out of it. Didn't you get it? Didn't you see it in the cafeteria? All the kids are totally emo. Now, if you don't happen to have had a child of the same age as mine, you might have missed this. Adolescents have these complex ways of differentiating and categorizing the different social groups. When I was a kid, we basically had three. We had the kids who were intellectual and academic, and I don't even remember if we quite called them nerds yet. And then we had the athletes, who were called jocks at the time. And then we had a third group that went by different names, but they're basically the kids who are on the pre-penitentiary track. It was simple back then. Well, now there are a lot more possibilities, and emo is one of those categories. Emo apparently refers to emotional, and these are kids who are artistically inclined and they feel a lot of angst, and they like to express it in creative work. So they may write novels, they may perform in plays, they may paint pictures. They're not quite as dark as the goth kids. The goth kids are basically frankly suicidal. The emo kids, they're okay, but they feel a lot. And somehow, my daughter was able to see what these kids were wearing, identify that they're emo, she's not emo, so she would never go to that school. Now, as grown-ups, we may think this doesn't affect us, but I think it does. I often ask audiences of mental health professionals, and I'll say, how many of you listen to National Public Radio, which, in the US is our kind of educational radio channel, and the vast majority of them raise their hands. And then I ask, how many of you either currently drive or aspire to drive someday a Hummer? And none of the hands go up. What is it? Do I have great clinical insight? Sociological acumen? No, it turns out that virtually nobody who listens to National Public Radio ever drives a Hummer. In fact, the Hummer may not even have stations on that part of the dial because there would be no use for them. So it's a madhouse in there. There's sense organs connecting with sense objects. That's being experienced in consciousness. There's feeling happening, intentions happening, perception happening. It's all happening at once. What mindfulness practice reveals is that it's all impersonal. There's nobody home. As the neurobiologist Wolf Singer put it famously, the brain and the mind are like an orchestra without a conductor. There's simply a continuous flow of moment-to-moment experience with a new self being born and dying in each moment. There isn't even a stable witness. There's just impersonal experience unfolding. Now, our normal sense of self creates all sorts of trouble. We might more accurately instead of thinking of having a self, think that selfing occurs. Because in each moment, we're responding out of this sense of agency or this sense of I. And we respond very differently when the experiences belong to me. It creates all sorts of further distortions. And endless suffering comes from this. These are the thoughts of, I'm better than you or I'm worse than you. I'm a moral person, I'm an immoral person. I'm talented, I'm not talented. And all of these other self-evaluative thoughts that happen. So whenever experiences arise, we tend to not just take them as they are or see them clearly, but we reflect on what do they mean about me. There's a famous quote about this that's attributed to Wei Wu Wei, who masquerades as though he's an ancient Taoist scholar. He's actually a British guy from the modern era. And his quote is this: "Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one." When we identify with the self, it makes pleasure and pain personal. It creates this fantasy of being able to control my experience and my insecurities, my competitive feelings, my aggression, jealousy, and all of these kinds of defensive things follow. Einstein put it beautifully. He said, "A human being is part of the whole called by us universe. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from the prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. The true value of a human being is determined by the measure and the sense in which they have obtained liberation from the self." Now, this has very interesting implications, and it touches on the idea of karma, which many of you probably know is associated with the teachings of many Indian but also Eastern cultures generally. And karma is traditionally understood in terms of reincarnation. The idea is that how we perform in this life determines how we will be reborn in the next. But karma can also be seen in moment-to-moment intentions. What becomes reborn is a certain constellation or attitude in consciousness. So my intention in one moment, whether I'm grasping onto something, pushing it away, acting out of anger, acting out of love, my intention at this moment tends to shape the perceptions and the feelings in the next moment, which creates the reality of the next moment. Now, the Buddha has been described as being like Copernicus of the mind, because he said that our identity is being recreated moment by moment, and that the continuity of self simply can't be found. It's illusory. All we have are frames in a movie and the mind's tendency to string these frames together into a narrative starring me that makes me feel that I exist. And all sorts of suffering, preoccupation with what's going to happen to me results from this. The Copernican shift he made was a figure ground shift, like the one Copernicus did when he said, you know, we can understand the solar system more clearly if instead of seeing the Earth as the center, we see the Earth as part of this larger set of entities. And Carl Jung, in a certain way, this student and colleague of Freud's, had a similar observation. He talked about what happens when we identify with some mental contents and reject others. He said that when we do this, it creates a kind of split-off shadow. It's almost a form of dissociation, a kind of splitting caused by trying to avoid pain. So if I think of myself, because I have a self-concept, as being generous, hardworking, and intelligent, then my greedy, lazy, and dumb side is going to be my shadow. And I'm going to have trouble every time I have a life circumstance that highlights the fact that I'm greedy, lazy, or dumb to some degree. And I'll go through the world seeking affirmation of who I want myself to be or who I think of myself as being. And if I'm in a relationship with somebody who does something that illuminates my greediness, my laziness, or my lack of being very smart, I'm going to get very uncomfortable and I will probably react to them in some kind of negative way. So we start to see how the very construction of this self sets us up for lots and lots of difficulties. As you're listening to this, though, you may be thinking, but wait a minute. Of course I exist. And indeed, the sense of self is a universal category of experience. Every language has words for you and for me. But it really is experienced differently in different cultures. And one of the things we see through mindfulness practice is we see how it is actually constructed not only by our moment-to-moment experience, but by the culture in which we live. As I mentioned earlier, we all get hooked on different dimensions or domains that define ourselves. For one person, it's physical beauty. Am I attractive enough? For another, it's athletic talent. For somebody else, it's financial status. Am I rich or poor? For yet another, it would be artistic creativity. Am I better able to express myself and create new works this way? For someone else, it's academic degree, or even whether they're wearing the correct designer outfit. A patient came in to see me and she was really in distress. She had been a former model and clothing mattered to her and appearance mattered to her, not surprisingly. And she had apparently gone to her bar mitzvah on Long Island and felt that she wasn't wearing the right level of designer dress. I didn't even know that designer dresses come in different levels, but she certainly did, and she had felt out of place, and that had been a very painful experience for her because she was afraid about other people and how they would look at her. So this causes all sorts of difficulties. The other thing that we discover is that there's no single self to be found. And we see this all the time in meditation practice. If I were to ask you, how was your last meditation session? You might report, if you were being accurate, well, there was part of me that was trying to attend to the breath. There was part of me that was fantasizing about the future. There was part of me that was judging myself for fantasizing about the future. We should really ask the committee how it went. In fact, it can be very useful in dealing with emotional difficulties to notice that there's no single coherent self, to notice that there's the committee. Often, when we're in distress, there are conflicts among different parts. Well, there's a part of me that wants to achieve more and be successful in my career. But there's a part of me that wants love and connection and wants to spend more time with my friends and family. There's a part of me that thinks it's very important to be social. And yet there's another part of me that completely craves and hungers for solitude. Seeing what each part wants and needs can really help us. There's a popular form of psychotherapy called internal family systems, practiced a lot in the Boston area. And this invites us to take time to recognize, honor, and draw out the fears and needs of each of these different parts. When each part is recognized in this way, the part itself feels safer, calms down, and doesn't need so much to run the show. When we're not identified with a single sense of self, this can facilitate a tremendous amount of flexibility because then we don't have to be one way or the other, and we can be much more accepting of our diverse and often complex experiences. This also has tremendous implications for our development. Mindfulness practices, like forms of psychotherapy, become a sort of loosening practice and loosening process, where the goal becomes not to be more one way or more of the other way in the sense of more perfect, but to develop a sense of psychological flexibility. In fact, there are some mindfulness-based psychotherapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, also called ACT, where the explicit goal is not feeling good about yourself, not even being successful in your endeavors, but simply having psychological flexibility, being able to be whoever or whatever you are in each moment. And this provides enormous relief from worrying so much about ourselves, from how we compare to others, about our pleasure or pain. It helps us to identify with something larger than ourselves, and this identification with something more than me becomes particularly important in any path to well-being. Now, both philosophers and scientists have described the interdependence that's revealed through mindfulness practice, the sense of being part of the superorganism. Here's how Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen teacher, describes this insight. Looking deeply into a flower, we see that the flower is made of non-flower elements. We can describe the flower as being full of everything. There's nothing that is not present in the flower. We see sunshine, we see the rain, we see clouds, we see the earth, and we also see time and space in the flower. A flower, like everything else, is made entirely of non-flower elements. The whole cosmos has come together in order to make the flower manifest herself. The flower is full of everything except one thing, a separate self or a separate identity. Or, as the astronomer Carl Sagan once famously said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. So I invite you to try a little exercise. Imagine what a day would be like if you no longer thought about yourself as a separate individual, and as a result, you had no concerns about how you or others saw yourself. This is a day in which you actually get it, that what you are is simply part of this larger, constantly changing, fluid collection of atoms and molecules that we call the universe. How might you dress if your sense of self didn't matter? How might you act with other people? What would you do during the day? What would matter to you? And in particular, how might you feel if it wasn't about me anymore, but it was simply about whatever you were engaged with? Most people find when they make the shift that all sorts of wonderful opportunities open up. In our next lecture, we're going to look at the implications of these insights into the nature of the self for psychological well-being. And we'll see how we may be able to go beyond, as Freud once put it, as the goal of psychoanalysis, changing neurotic misery into common unhappiness.